Good afternoon. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and today's program with Allan Gotlieb and his book, The Washington Diaries, 1981 to 1989. I'm David Biet, and I'm director of the Center's Canada Institute. For those of you who have never visited the Wilson Center before, welcome. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is the presidential memorial, a living memorial to the 28th President of the United States, the only president to hold a doctorate degree. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue. Within that context, the Canada Institute encourages dialogue on issues about Canada and the Canada-U.S. relationship. Today I'm happy to welcome Christopher Ogden, who will introduce Allan Gotlieb and lead a conversation with Mr. Gotlieb about his experiences in Washington and about his book. I hope you can join us after today's presentation for a reception in the Moynihan Boardroom across the hall. Mr. Gottlieb's book will be available for purchase there if you didn't get one before. Chris Ogden is a noted journalist and author. He was Time Magazine's chief diplomatic correspondent from 1989 to 1992 and served as bureau chief in London and Chicago. He was also a Time national political correspondent and reported for Time from Los Angeles. And I hope I get all this right. Before he left the magazine, he wrote about politics and foreign affairs in the View from Washington column for Time's international editions. He, like Allan Gotlieb, is a keen observer of life here in Washington. Chris is the author of several noted biographies, including Legacy, a biography of Moses and Walter Annenberg, Life of the Party, the biography of Pamela Digby Churchill Hayward Harriman, and Maggie, an intimate portrait of a woman in power, a biography of Margaret Thatcher. I'd also like to thank Allan Gotlieb for coming to the Center today. He serves on the Canada Institute's advisory board and was the recipient of the Woodrow Wilson Award for Public Service in Toronto in 2002. He is an astute observer of Canada-U.S. relations, and it seems I can't write much about the relationship without quoting him. Thanks, Allan. I hope you enjoy today's program. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And thank you all for coming today. Thanks. It's cold, it's dark, and thank you for coming. And it's very good to have the ambassador back in town, where he and his wife, Sondra, had such a positive and productive impact. Unfortunately, I wasn't here to witness any of that. A point I made when I was asked to participate in this program today, I was in London for most of the Reagan administration covering Margaret Thatcher, while Allan was here representing Canada for the Trudeau and the Mulroney governments and the brief Turner administration. And I'll admit that the prospect of settling down with a former Canadian ambassador's diaries, and it brought to my mind a friend's request once if I'd go over his manuscript for a biography he was writing about the U.S. diplomat Hugh Alexis Johnson. And I thought, oh God, this is going to be just another snore-thon. But the Canadian embassy in Washington, and not the glorious structure that Allan helped ensure was built, but the residence where he and Sondra resided has a very special place in my heart. Because there, thanks to a Canadian diplomat here in the room today, Paul Fraser, that's where I was introduced in those beautiful gardens tended by the Gotliebs and other Canadian ambassadors. In that beautiful garden at a wonderful dinner party, I met my wife, Linda. So I'll do pretty much anything for Canada. So then the book arrived, and it's gigantic. I mean, 613 pages. And I had a flurry of second thoughts. I mean, how much do I really like Canada? But that's 2 pages shorter than my own latest book, so I thought, all right, be kind. I gave it the Washington read. I went straight to the index. And of course, there's no mention of me, but why would there be? I wasn't here, and the ambassador and I didn't know each other, but hope springs. I see a reference to some journalist friends of mine and how he describes them, the ambassador, as being superb in learning and better, more experienced than many of the people that he's met in the administration. I think, well, this is promising. He's got maybe a pretty good idea about journalists. And then there are references to some of the subjects in my biographies, and I checked them out. And they're smart, and they're accurate. So I dive in. And I realize almost immediately that these diaries of Allan Gotlieb's are terrific. They're terrific. They're insightful. They're perceptive. They're extremely well observed. They're funny. They're bark out loud, laugh funny in some places. There's a scene where he's in the office of Senator Jennings Randolph of Virginia that I'll tell you, in 2/3 of a page, it explains to you how Washington operates. In less than a page, he gives you more insight into how Washington really works than entire volumes that I've read on the subject. There's important behind-the-scenes detail, and it's presented in a compelling, surprisingly compelling fashion, I found. His description of the very complex effort to pass the free trade agreement, I mean, I was lost on this before, but it reads like it could have been in a thriller. Twists, turns, drama, tension, backstabbing, it's all there. Great stuff for historians. And as important as what he saw and did was how he saw and did it. And I've got to tell you, I've dealt with scores of ambassadors and diplomats from countries all over the world, in those countries and here in this city. And I've got to tell you that Allan was operating unlike any that I'd ever experienced before. He'd been a bureaucrat for years, decades of bureaucrat in Ottawa. He could have done this job the old-fashioned way, but he didn't. He was a revolutionary, an absolute, almost bomb-throwing revolutionary. He redefined how an intelligent, confident, and a creative diplomat, and he's all of those, could approach a really complicated and evolving system of governance here in the United States and maximize the benefit for Canada, which after all is the purpose of the whole thing. What he discovered, he explained at one point, was that to operate successfully in Washington, you have to forget everything you ever learned about diplomacy. It has no value here whatsoever. To try to promote your country's interests in the traditional way through the Foreign Ministry, through the State Department, you'll not only accomplish nothing, you'll be recalled in a heartbeat. But this very different approach on Capitol Hill and in the salons of Georgetown, he managed to penetrate these intersecting sectors of influence with his not-so-secret weapon, Sondra Gotlieb, his wife. But all of this he brings to life in very human terms in this book. And at one point you said that on the biggest issues, ambassadors are voyeurs, they're kibitzers, and that the ambassador's greatest challenge is to be more than that, more than a voyeur, more than just seeing what's going on. It's a challenge that you have to break through and to be more than that, and it was a challenge that you really more than met. So while I read this, I thought of Harold Nicholson's War Year Diaries in Britain, and those of John Colville, who was Winston Churchill's private secretary, but with the wonderful character sketches and insights, and delicious, dishy gossip as well, and really worthy, this kind that you'd see in Evelyn Waugh or Truman Capote. And while I'm on writers, I'll just tell you that Allan Gotlieb can do more than observe, he can write. So let's get to it. One warning to those of you here who may be specialists. I'm going to resist the urge, I've got a big urge to do this, but I'm going to resist the urge to have them analyze the quotas and tariff system. I'm going to have them hold off, you can get to this, but I'm not going to ask them about specialty steels and yogurt and shingles and shakes and that ever compelling issue that may have brought some of you here today, stumpage. But you'll have your chance to get at them directly, because I'll ask them a few questions and then we're going to turn it open to you as well. So here we go. Okay. In Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney, you worked for two very substantial leaders with profoundly different personalities and different governing styles, not least in how they dealt with the United States. Trudeau and Reagan didn't get along particularly well politically or substantively. Mulroney and Reagan did. So tell us about the importance of personal rapport at the top and how you dealt with the varying Republican attitudes toward these two leaders.
Well, in my experience, thank you, by the way, for those extremely kind introductory words, Christopher. My only regret, at least one of my major regrets I could see now, is that you weren't in Washington when I was here. Well, my experience, and I guess it's Everybody's experience will differ to some extent, but in my experience, the personal relationship was of absolute critical importance during the Reagan era. I think Mrs. Thatcher understood that, and I think Brian Mulroney understood it. But Pierre Trudeau could not warm up to Ronald Reagan. Pierre Trudeau was a brilliant man, but he had this notion that, and I don't want to be unfair to him because he's not here to on this planet to respond, but I mean Trudeau regarded Ronald Reagan as an actor, and how can you take seriously an actor who becomes the leader of a country? I think it was Gore Vidal. I don't know if this is in my diaries or not, but who said that the greatest fraud perpetrated on the American people was that Ronald Reagan was a B actor. He said Ronald Reagan wasn't a B actor. Ronald Reagan was an A actor who performed in a lot of B films. Well, I think that Trudeau underestimated him as an actor, and he had a certain disdain for Reagan, and because he was an elder statesman at that time, and a very an impressive man, a brilliant man, an intellectual of the first order, he had the habit, and I'm not just making this up, he had the habit of lecturing the president and all the people around him, and I guess Reagan himself felt that he was being lectured too. And the sad part of this was that Trudeau was not able to take advantage of a very key dimension of Reagan's personality. In the diaries, I do tell the story that because Mulroney was not liked in the White House, and because of the national energy policy, which was Canadianizing energy and oil companies, we weren't exactly the Chavez of the era, but we were in the doghouse. And I remember once, and I was getting nowhere. I had no real access, but through a long series of accidents, I did get to develop some kind of relationship with Dick Darman, who still lives in this town. And he asked me once, he said, well, why don't we talk over to save the relationship? Why don't you come into the White House and we'll talk about it? And we made up a list of different problems, and I was elated that, that I had this interlocutor in the White House. It was fantastic. But he said, as I was walking out, he says, when Canada comes up for us in the White House here and our advisors to the president, it's bad news and it's good news. And I said, well, what do you mean it's bad news and it's good news? He says, well, the bad news is that Reagan really likes Canada. In fact, Reagan's got a real soft spot for Canada. So I said, that's the bad news. What's the good news? Well, the good news is you people are too stupid to realize it. Yeah. And that was absolutely the case. So, and when Mulroney came to power, he recognized this very. Reagan had a concept of North America. It was the kind of, and to make a long story short, in the great tent called exceptionalism, there was a place for Canada. And I think that Mulroney set out to develop a personal, a good, warm, friendly relationship with him. And without that relationship, I don't think we would have got a free trade agreement. I don't think we ultimately would have made the progress on offset rain that we did in the time we did. And so I think the personal relationship, whatever they say in the textbooks and whatever they say in academia, is absolutely key and important in terms of getting things done at the highest levels of diplomacy. Let me say, even if you're an embassy, how many embassies you got in this town? 160, 170. You throw in the other ones, the Organization of American States, you've got a couple of hundred. Even if you're dealing with governments, the queue is so long they'd be outside the White House as far as Pennsylvania. So without a personal relationship, without a rapport, how are you going to get anybody to listen at the highest levels of government? You can't.
And Mulroney understood that precisely
Instinctively understood it, and acted on it.
Mm-hmm. The very first meeting, jokes, got him going.
Got him going. There was, without doubt, Mulroney established a deep personal rapport with Ronald Reagan, and did not underestimate him.
I'll get to the Hill and the panjandrums and the special interests in just a second, but tell us about dealing with the cabinet secretaries, because Reagan had a solid cabinet who I think thought that they were going to have a lot of influence, but I recall you writing saying that dealing with the cabinet secretaries is dealing with a bunch of fellows who have gigantic offices and almost no power.
Well, I was certainly appreciated. I was stunned by those offices. I don't know. Many of you must have had an opportunity. They're all built during the WPA area, agriculture, justice, all those out and down on Constitution, independence. They are staggering. They're magnificent. They're wonderful. But there almost seems to be a kind of inverse relationship between the size of the office and the amount of power that you exercise. I was fortunate to develop some wonderful relationships with some very outstanding cabinet secretaries like Mac Baldridge in Commerce, the late Mac Baldridge, French Smith, the late Attorney General, Elizabeth Dole in Labor. But invariably, I mean, they would listen to me politely, and they were very polite. I had wonderful access, and they would hear my story. And you know what? That was the end of it. Nothing happened. The goodwill was there. And what they might do, I mean, most helpfully say, well, why don't you go see so-and-so, you know? So I'd pick up my traveling bag or wares and go see somebody. But there is another thing that is, I quote this in my diaries, and to me it was the most perceptive remark that I heard in the first year I was in Washington when I was doing my wares, and it was by a fellow diplomat, and no mean diplomat. He was a brilliant man. Some of you might remember him, Sir Nico Henderson, who was the British ambassador, and he was in a class by himself.
Very smart.
Yeah, very smart guy. Oh, he had Georgetown eating out of his hand, and he had the White House. He was a remarkable performer. And when I went to him, I made a courtesy call, this ridiculous, archaic tradition where out of the Middle Ages where ambassadors call on other ambassadors. Total waste of time. But I did call on him. And he was, I remember, dealing with a number of issues. The Polish ambassador had just defected or something. And then I don't know why, but he turned around and he says, well, he said, Gotlieb, or whatever we call him, he says, this is a very, very hard town to figure. He says, anybody that in this town that tells you that he knows where a particular decision was made and how it was made, anybody that tells you that, and if you can identify where it was made, he's a fool or he's a liar. And because power is so decentralized and so dispersed. And what I discovered, I mean, coming from a parliamentary system, you talk to the cabinet secretary, the cabinet minister, he's the ultimate power, subject only to the prime minister. So if the cabinet minister, the minister of fisheries tells me the issue is, I commit myself, the issue is solved, it's going to be solved. Parliamentarians have no power in a parliamentary system unless it's a minority government. But in the United States, you just, in your country, you just take your bag and you take your samples and you go from office to office. And when you're finished doing that, you go to the Hill. And that, you know how much I love the United States, and I'm often, I think, regarded as a bon Dieu back in my own state, Canada, because of my alleged sympathy for the American point of view. So you won't feel that I am being unkind. But when you are on the Hill, it is theater, and more often than not, it's the theater of the absurd.
Well, if you can't have access all the time to the president or the principal, and you've got cabinet secretaries who don't necessarily have any particular power, so you have to find some other intersections of power. And I noticed that you wrote in reference to Trudeau and Reagan at one point that the entire, all the information in one letter you had to the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa came all from people whom you had spoken to at parties, not in their offices. No information whatsoever from any official in his office. So success through access means different things in Washington.
It means different things, but it primarily means that you can establish a personal relationship outside of outside of formal channels of communication.
If you don't,
you don't know what's going on. In my case, I had the most vivid example of that. When I came down here for the first 6 or 8 months, I knew that Trudeau was unpopular, but I had no particular notion of the attitudes in the White House. And I was at a party. It was given by one of the hostesses, and I deal a lot with the hostesses in my book. She's now deceased, Joan Braden. You might remember it. She was quite a well-known hostess. And I had never even met Mike Deaver, who was at this time the most influential single person, I think, on Mrs. Reagan and on the president himself. And he spied me at this party, and he signaled me. And I was talking at that time to the late Joe Kraft, who was a wonderful journalist, and I said, Joe, I don't want to insult you, but somebody signaled me, and it happens to be Mike Deaver. And he said to me, he says, you know, Ambassador, he says, I'll tell you something, I'm quite concerned. And I said, yeah? I said, what is it? He says, your guy and my guy are not getting along. And that's bad, and we got to do something about it. And I learned more from that, and he said, come around and see me.
Your guy being Trudeau at that point.
Yeah. I learned more from that conversation than I did from all the official communications that I was getting. I really only got, and then I was able to write Trudeau. And I was able to, and some of the misinformation that was circulating was horrendous.
Well, by seeing these people on, whether it be a Sunday brunch or an evening during the week, I mean, you could then get to them also in emergencies, which was sometimes critical.
Absolutely. Who's going to answer your call if you're calling, if something critical comes up and you're a foreign ambassador and you want to call Cap Weinberger at 1 in the morning, is he going to take your call? Will he take it any time of the day or night? We even have his phone number. You haven't got a chance. You've got to establish a personal relationship. And if you don't, then forget it.
Dead. You write that the most knowledgeable, the most knowledge and the most experience about Canada exists on Capitol Hill, generally. And then, so what's the best way to work the Hill? Because as you said, you show up with your bag of samples. It's no easy thing to beg and maintain much dignity. And you tell a fabulous story about dealing with Russell Long on trading chits up there. But how do you deal? What's the best way to deal with the Hill?
Well, I think of course, the reason why I say that the knowledge is there on the Hill is because even if you're, as you know, if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you're there for life if you want, with a 90-95% re-election rate. So you accumulate great knowledge, and some of the staffers have huge knowledge. I think the answer to that question, and it is the toughest question of all, is I went on the principle that a foreign country, which is Canada's, we have no friends and we have no enemies. The enemies and the friends are on the issues. And therefore, you have to look at every issue and you have to figure out, you have to have a micro strategy for that particular issue. And you have to figure out, like Senator Moynihan, who's memorialized in this building. Moynihan was a great friend of Canada on acid rain, because New York was being affected by acid rain falling on their lakes. But on other issues like border broadcasting, he was the scourge of Canada, absolute scourge of Canada, and was, I think, participated in mirror legislation by way of retaliation. And I would go see him on an issue like acid rain, and he would throw raspberries, strawberries, and apples at me because these were the issues of concern to his constituency. So once you know, you've got to know the structure of the committee, you've got to know the players, and you've got to figure out who are your friends, on your enemies on that issue, and then you form alliances. So it's a constant set of shifting. But I think that you do earn a certain respect in this town if you know the game and you know how to play it.
But if you just listen to these guys say, I love Canada, you won't get very far.
You will get no absolutely hollow words, which I remember I do recount in the diaries when I went to see Senator Mitchell, one of your most high-minded and distinguished Democratic senator's a great champion of liberalism and causes, and a man for whom I have the highest possible respect. And I saw him on some issue, and I said I do set out some detail in those diaries, and I said, you know, you're a friend of Canada. Look at the trade between us, Senator. Look at, you know, there are 2,047,000 tourists from Quebec on the beaches of Maine as we talk, you know, and you have the balance of trade, and we're God. Oh yes, he said, we're friends with our friends. And I said, well, can we count on your support on this issue? And he said, let me be frank, Mr. Ambassador. I'm going to do all I can to defeat you on this issue. I'm going to fight it, and I'm going to fight it as hard as I can, and I will vote against it, and I'll vote against your free trade agreement unless you accommodate me on these 200 potato farmers. And we didn't accommodate him on the 200 potato farmers, and he voted against the agreement.
Well, why?
And I'm a friend of Canada, don't forget.
And would say it to this day if he were with us.
That's right. Yeah.
What is it about the Canadian constituency on the Hill, though? You write in here that, you know, Israel has a big constituency, Greece has a constituency, Italy has a constituency. There doesn't seem to be much of a constituency for Canada. Why is that? And while we're at it, why did the State Department for so long consider Canada an extension of Europe?
Well, on the first issue, the fact is we have no constituency, and I'm not surprised because, you know, one of the stories I would tell on the hustings, if let me say, is when I would visiting the consulates, and once in a while I go out there, and the consul general would in Florida. I went there, and he would brief me, and I'd say, well, he'd say, now you should go on this hotline program, big hotline program. So this guy's got a huge listenership. So I said, okay, I'll go. Sure. What's he going to ask me? He said, the first question he's going to ask you is how many Canadians there are in Florida now, as we speak. He says, what's the answer? So he says, well, I think you'd be safe to say between 2 and 3 million or so. So I said, thanks very much. I got the question. I gave the answer. Then I went a month or two later to California. Consul General says, go on the hotline show. They'll ask you a question. What are they going to ask me? How many Canadians are in California? So I said, well, roughly maybe. He said, roughly maybe. I don't know, not exactly. I mean, I say, you know, you're comfortable with maybe 1.5 million to 2.5 million. Then I went to Arizona. So my punchline, when I talked to Arnie, I said, I realized after, 6 months in the United States that Canada is a country at that time with 29 million people, 52 million of whom are living in the United States. So how could you have a constituency like that? And beside that, they all left Canada because presumably they'd never live in the States. So, and then we are the greatest thing about my country, I think, is we're not the most nationalistic of nations. I mean, I hope that there's a kind of sense of moderation that we have. We love our country. We're patriotic, I suppose you could say. But I don't, Canadians, I mean, I cannot see any Canadian going to the polls and voting against a congressman or an elected person because of his stance on Canada. Just isn't there. But your second question was about...
Well, why they tended to lump you in with Europe so often for so long, at least diplomatically.
Well, this is a strange story, but we were seen because of NATO. I think essentially we were an extension of Europe, and a lot of us felt that this showed kind of lack of respect. We were the last man on the totem pole. It wasn't. We were, and I remember in those conversations I had with the White House and with Dick Darman. He said, Allan, as long as you are an appendage of Europe, as long as it's the Department of Assistant Secretary or the Bureau of European and Canadian Affairs, you'll get no attention whatsoever. George Shultz, that bothered him too. He didn't change it radically, but he renamed it. It was simply the European Bureau. George Bush, when he was in his 7 years, he renamed it the Bureau, European and Canadian Bureau. And he was the first, probably changed now, to a point where the only country to have a separate DAS, Deputy Assistant Secretary. So he did, but we stayed as a part of the European Bureau. Somewhere along the line, and you people who are close to it here will know that it changed. And we got transferred to the American Bureau. And did it improve our condition in Washington? I don't think so.
Latin America and Canada, there you go.
That's right, yeah. We went from the margins to the margins.
Well, so they use this against you all the time, going back to the earlier thing about the big national, not the strong nationalist feeling, the fact that you're going to be such a decent neighbor. They actually use it to your disadvantage often. And at one point you're writing about how the United States ridiculed Canada's plans to build some of its own nuclear submarines, 10 or 12 nuclear submarines. They want us to behave like a little boy, not a big one, you wrote. They didn't want Canada to protect its own Arctic. How do you deal with that kind of we-they situation?
Well, that was a we-they situation which was almost unique in one-off, the nuclear submarine issue. Generally speaking, it's very hard, and I want to say something about that situation, but it's very hard to expect a sympathetic audience in the United States when Canadians differ from the Americans. And I have tried to interpret that. I've interpreted often as saying the reason is that the American people, and I can't speak for you in this room, but basically have a hard time seeing Canadians as foreigners. We're cousins, we're family members. You Americans expect Frenchmen to behave like Frenchmen. They expect foreigners to behave like foreigners, but they expect Canadians to behave like Americans. And because they see us as Americans, and when we don't, then we are seen as perverse Americans or naughty Americans. So we have a hard time transcending that we-they thing. As far as the United States is concerned, it ain't they, it's we, and we should behave like we. I just have to say a word about this remarkable nuclear submarine phenomenon, which is dealt with at great length in my diaries, and has received very little attention, I think. But Canada, in the late Mulroney years, decided to become a nuclear power. And we wanted to power our submarines in the north by nuclear power and nuclear-powered submarines, which I thought was a great idea, a real coming of age, because we are always so pure and innocent. We don't do things like that. And since we claimed about a zillion square miles up there in the north, it made a lot of sense. And the United States, your country, was so shocked by this, the notion that we would aspire to have nuclear-powered submarines, that your Navy and and their lobbyists and friends did all they could to prevent this from happening. Actually, it's a long story, but Mulroney actually persuaded Ronald Reagan and not to block it. But as it happened, Canada backed down from that, from our desire to have the weapons, the submarines.
But this behaving like a Boy Scout all the time, you seem to step up and challenge that, because when they would say things to you like, "Go away, we'll deal with this," this was never a position that would satisfy you. I mean, you fought for your turf on that.
Well, I really felt, and I do bring it out there ad nauseum, that the most important thing we can do is to explain that we are two separate peoples. I've said with the greatest sense of goodwill, that we have different, conflicting at occasion national interests, and that it is no point in covering them up or hiding them. We need to discuss them intelligently. And I felt that was the right approach, and provided that it is not motivated by sentiments of anti-Americanism or sentiment of the sort. If it's genuinely based on a differing national interest, then I think it's just overwhelmingly the case that you can build some sympathy and understanding that interests don't always coincide.
One of the big issues that came up on your watch was Iran-Contra, and you wrote in June 1987, so 20 years ago, that the issue was essentially a power struggle between the White House and Congress, and that Congress wanted to micromanage foreign policy, and that it would take years to assess its significance. So with apologies to the great Chinese foreign minister who said it was too early to assess the results of the French Revolution, let me ask you that 20 years after Iran-Contra, how do you assess it now?
I think I basically got it wrong at the time. My view, the way I read it at the time, and the way I was reporting it back to Ottawa, was that I didn't think that Reagan or the administration could recover from the scandals of that time. I had reported and I'd sent back messages and say, don't bother knocking on the White House door. Nobody home. It's closed. There was a hunkering down. There was a state of tremendous drawing inward, and there was a state of shock. And what I was reporting is that the president was astonished by all this and couldn't understand how this. And I thought that the president would be permanently weakened, and the presidency once again would suffer a major blow to its prestige and standing. And when I said that ultimately, though it might take 20 or 30 years, that maybe I was premature in thinking that. But I believe I got it wrong, because I think that the record does show that the presidency recovered. I don't think there was permanent damage to the White House. Of course, at that time, people were speculating the president might have already been ill, or was past this. But I think that the facts are clear that the prestige of the presidency did not suffer, nor did his standing, your president's standing in your own eyes. I was just picked up the other day a recent copy of the Atlantic Monthly, and it had, I don't know, you can't pick up anything with it, who was the greatest this and who was the greatest that, and who's the worst this and who's the worst that. But this is one more kind of survey of the greatest presidents, 1 to 100. I don't know if you haven't had 100, but one right down at the bottom of the barrel. And there was Reagan up there, I don't know, 7 or 6 or 8 or something. And I think that I don't think the legacy there at all was that there was an irreversible and permanent damage to the institution of the presidency, or him, or to him personally.
Of course, this administration now, if you were reporting on it now, you'd see the attempt to consolidate power back in the White House, though, which over these past years has been a steady effort on their part. Do you think that may be an attempt to claw back more authority in the White House?
Well, I'm not a student of American history, but I think that the whole history of the United States, in terms of the operation of the performance of under the Constitution of the organs representing the separation of powers, is an attempt to maintain that power and to claw it back when possible, because it's a constant state of tension. It's a dragging back and forth. It never ends, and it never will.
One of the things that's really changed, and you pointed it out when you first got here, you noticed it, and it's only become more obvious and more significant, which is the prevalence of special interests as a really determining aspect of how we govern here. And one of the things you wrote about was that there's a need to change the approach to the whole management of the relationship, and that Ottawa and Washington might consider sharing institutional arrangements. What did you have in mind there?
Well, I went through 2 phases in my assessment or reassessment. 3 phases of assessment of the United States. When I first came down, I was of the view that the presidency, the administration, had to be the primary and overwhelming and even exclusive focus of our diplomatic efforts. In fact, for most of our history before my time, the embassy staff was not allowed to work the Hill, were not allowed to go in the Hill. Most ambassadors did not go in the Hill. If I have any modest claim to fame, I certainly reversed that. That became congressional relations became a main target of our effort. So we did very much reorient our efforts towards a direct influence on the Hill. But once you do that, you recognize, and this was one of the great blinding insights I had, which again I record in these. I gave it in my farewell address to the National Press Club. I think it's the, as far as I'm concerned, it's the Holy Writ, although I wrote it, and that is, remember that in the Congress of
like a journalist.
that's right, in the Congress of the United States, a foreign power is just another special interest, and not a very special one at that. So you got to behave like a special interest, but it may not take you very far, because you're outpowered and outgunned by much stronger special interests who can contribute directly to parties, who can contribute directly to, so that you've got to behave like a special interest, but if you rely on that completely, you're going to be badly hurt and disappointed. And you have to, the whole business of being a special interest is a question of which other special interests you align yourself with, because you'll never have the clout. So you've got to be basically micro-strategizing your on every issue and aligning yourself with domestic special interests who have more clout than you. And then the next thing you have to have, you can get nowhere in the Congress as a special interest. This I believe absolutely. That Canada went overboard, if I may say, on the notion of the answer was lobbying. In recent years, Canadian commentators started talking about a permanent campaign, permanent campaign on the Hill. And, it's wrong. You can't get anywhere on the Hill as a special interest if you've got the administration against you. You just can't. If the White House is against you, you can forget it. You can lobby all you want. You won't get very far. If they're neutral, yeah, you can do a lot, because a lot of these little things get on the bills late at night, in the dark of day, little Buy America here, a little, whack over some other issue, a little trade restraint there. And half the time the administration, I don't think it's an exaggeration, even aware of it. So you can, if the administration is neutral, you've got some room to maneuver. But you need the administration on your side in all the big ones. And if you want to be a special interest and act like a special interest, you're losing the greatest advantage that a foreign state has, and that is the potential for access to the central levers of power in the White House.
This is my last question from me, and then we'll open it up to everybody. But one of the most striking permanent features of your time here, Ambassador, was this magnificent building just down Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean, this is an extraordinary embassy structure. It certainly wasn't going to get built. You fought for it tooth and nail, and it happened. What's it mean?
What's it?
What it means something very special to you and to Canada to have that kind of presence.
I think it is a remarkable example of the special relationship. Now, a lot of Canadians don't like talking about a special relationship, but I think it is an example of a special relationship. I think we not only have a special relationship, I think we want to have a special relationship, and I think we're fortunate to have it. And we are, and I believe we'll probably always be, the only embassy on the main, inside the central precinct of your government. And I think it is so that millions of Americans come by as they go down to your capital and to your great cultural institutions, and they see this is the symbol of Canada. And so I think it's a remarkable evidence of a vision that the Canadian government had. There are a lot of criticism of Canada. Even when I was down here, I would have some journalists, Canadian journalists, say, don't you think putting the embassy there is a reflection of the subordination of Canada to the Congress and to the United States? So it wasn't free of controversy. But let me just add one thing. We wanted it, ultimately. The government said we want that site. It was identified by the State Department, and then we went for it. But we wouldn't have got it without the vision of some Americans. And one of the visionaries was, again, Senator Patrick Daniel Moynihan. he really wanted to see the embassy there, and he went to bat for it. And Senator Howard Baker was another. So there were a number of senators who saw it fitting and appropriate that the Canadian embassy should stand there at the access of Constitution and Pennsylvania as a permanent symbol of our friendship.
It's a great job, really was. But it was a fight.
It was.
Let's open it up. Tim. I think there's a mic for you.
I'm Timothy Towell, retired Foreign Service officer. Great to see you, Mr.
Timothy,
Minister.
hello.
Good to see you. I want to go back to your point and ask a question about Trudeau, the intellectual who didn't get along that well with Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan, the actor, grade A or B, we can let go. You and I first met when I was Ronald Reagan's deputy chief of protocol for 5.5 years, and it was at the Williamsburg Summit. And let me recall something that happened there. The first event was the great black tie dinner, the great dinner, and everybody was supposed to arrive. This theater was orchestrated by the great theatrical actor Mike Deaver. Everybody was supposed to arrive by carriage. I'm doing the timing, radios, and all that stuff. And Deaver turns to me and says, "Where, expletive, is Trudeau?" And where was he? He was not in his buggy. He was not doing what he was supposed to do. All of a sudden, there he appears. He decided on his own, didn't clear it with anybody, to walk. And I'm sure you were there in the gaggle walking next to him, sir. And surrounded by our stuff, the free press with their cameras rolling. So here was Class A theater. It was pissing off Mike Deaver of Trudeau with his boutonniere, his wonderful rosebud in his collar, in his boutonniere, walking slowly, screwing up the timing, and making a grand entrance. The next day, that's being a great actor.
Trudeau marched to his own drummer, I believe.
That was grade A acting. The next day was the first working session. Ronald Reagan did not like Francois Mitterrand. Protocol means the number one guy sits on your right, correct? We put him, since it's a working session, face to face, and that meant Mrs. Thatcher's here. He loved her. And Prime Minister Trudeau was there. He's number 2 in the pecking order. So all of the clippings in your scrapbook and all of the TV all over the world the next day, we saw Mitterrand's little bald pate back here, and we saw Ronald Reagan, the actor, charming, talking to Mrs. Thatcher and talking to Prime Minister Trudeau. So I think that's a bit of a mix, and I would like your reaction to that Class A theater of your former Prime Minister, who I have great respect for, had great respect for. Thank you.
No, I wouldn't quarrel with the word you said. Trudeau loved theater, and he loved people on the stage, and he loved to be on the stage, and there's no question that you're right. He had a great sense of theater. I remember that Williamsburg Summit so well because I remember when he arrived, and I think that we were in a car together, and he was going down there, and he was dressed like a peacock. He had a kind of white linen suit and a wonderful flappy hat, and he was as conscious of his appearance as a young lady on her first prom. He was had a tremendous sense of theater. So
one of those ladies he might have been meeting later.
More of them he might have been later. So perhaps part of his resentment was he really did think that Reagan was a B actor and he was an A actor.
Yes.
Bruce Nesbitt, Mr. Gotlieb. Would you be willing to comment on the relations between the Canadian Armed Forces and the American Armed Forces during your tenure?
Well, my experience was, I don't want to sound banal, but they were good, and they were always good. They were always good. I think that's one of the positive parts of the relationship. No matter what the strains might have been at different times, there was always good communication between our armed forces in the two countries, and I think that they constantly looked for ways to strengthen cooperation. The only problems in that area that were I think caused pain was ultimately we entered into historic agreements in the early 50s to share defense production, and there was a slow closing of the doors throughout the 70s and the 80s, but that wasn't because of the armed forces or the military. It was because on the procurement side of the Defense Department. But I think to this day and to this very hour, the relationship between the military in both countries is of the first order.
And sharing information.
Sharing information, yeah.
Is good.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I'm Sunil Chako with New Info Solutions. Two brief questions. One on the U.S. and the other on Canada. During the Reagan era, it was kind of well known that there were three personal and professional friends of President Reagan: Senator Malcolm Wallop of Wyoming, Paul Laxalt of Nevada, and Jack Kemp of New York, Congressman. The three were sort of liaisons between the Congress and the White House. They were personal friends and professional colleagues. There is nobody, it seems, like that today. Can you comment on their role and on how useful that was, and whether that is hampering the effectiveness of the president today? And the other one, to follow up on the intellectual Pierre Trudeau, was there a designated successor? Did he see a designated successor in his team? And also, why is it no longer popular to fit in that mold that is of an intellectual politician? Thanks.
Well, you're undoubtedly right about Reagan's relationships, and I don't know that I could give you any evidence of the consequences of their role in terms of our relationship. I did know Senator Laxalt very well, and he, in fact, I did benefit from being able to see him often in a social context. That enabled me to meet with a number of his friends, and they were all part of the Reagan of the second circle or of advisors. So Laxalt was a very important person for Canada and for myself to establish a relationship in particular. Less so in my case than with Wallop. But I don't know today if I don't have the knowledge to say whether there are any equivalents. Obviously, such people are extremely useful to a president in getting a reading of the political potential and pitfalls on the Hill. I don't think that if you ask me about Trudeau and his successor, I don't think that he had a. I don't think he ever had a successor in mind. I know one thing for sure: he did not have his successor in mind. It wouldn't have been his choice. Prime Minister, who became Prime Minister shortly, John Turner, was not. I don't think he would not have advocated. I don't think he had some Canadians might correct me, but I don't recall that he had a successor in mind. But the intellectual tradition, if I understood your last point, is not completely dead. In Canada, at least, we currently both of our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and the Leader of the Opposition, these are highly intelligent men. And I think that somebody might throw a brick at me, but I think they could both be classified as intellectuals.
Good. Nice that you can say that, because we're feeling some pressure on this side of the border in that regard.
I refrain from commenting on that.
Yeah. Any more? Yes, in the back.
I will take this. I think it was came up last couple of weeks when President Ford died. There's a quote attributed to him: "You can disagree without being disagreeable." And it sort of ebbs and flows in the Canada-U.S. relationship, whether we're being disagreeable towards each other or not. And I wonder if you could, and certainly in your diaries, Mr. Gotlieb, there's a lot of you sort of telling the folks back and at it, but you just don't get it. And I wonder how much of the disagreeableness is always going to be there, or how we get over that, and how Canadians can surmount it, how Americans can surmount it?
Well, it's obviously it's a critical importance when you're not in agreement to have maximum civility maintained at all times. I think the problem is in the nature of politics itself, that there are constituencies that politicians are tempted to serve, and occasionally, I don't think this is true of the prime ministers I've known in Canada, with possibly one exception, but I don't think it's been true that they would play directly to that constituency. But there is a constituency in Canada that would applaud if someone stood up and stuck it to the yank, so to speak, or made some comment which was not free of stridency, shall we put it, or there is a certain constituency. I think that any Canadian politician, mainline politician, that played directly that constituency would never get elected. I think the people would not want that. But there are politicians, there are backbenchers, and there are others who are attempted to, and we've been through that in Canada, we've seen that. And in the case of Trudeau himself, who probably relations were as distant between him and Reagan as any two leaders in modern times, as far as Canada is concerned, he was never uncivil. He had a great respect for office of all kinds, and although I don't think ever developed any rapport or feeling for Reagan, there was always a civility. But what, in civil terms, he did develop in public discourse a tendency, as I said earlier, to try to lecture or to which could be interpreted as someone expressing a point of view from a standpoint of a higher moral plane, and that kind of thing can be as disagreeable as being disagreeable. Yes.
Yes, in the front.
Louisa.
Oh. Yeah, Louisa Savage, Maclean's magazine. Could you comment a bit about the extent to which Mexico figured at all in your relationship at the time? Because when I look around now, one of the biggest issues for Canada is the thickening, as we call it, of the physical land border between Canada and the U.S. and the impediments that's putting on trade and tourism. And it seems like part of the discussion is, well, we're worried about the Mexican border and we're not being anti-Mexican, so let's talk about the northern border as well, even though obviously they're treated in different ways, and security comes into this as well. But I'm just curious to get your thoughts on how this trilateral situation of NAFTA, Canada, U.S., Mexico, the summits with the three leaders, how that affects the bilateral relationship.
Well, it's a very good question, and I try to do justice to it as quickly as possible. First, I should say that when Canada, it was the Canadian initiative to establish a free trade agreement with the United States. We never dreamed that Mexico would be part of it. It was a bilateral relationship. That's what we believed. After it was concluded, Mexico indicated it wanted a similar relationship. I think the initial reaction of Canada was very cautious. And I was not in government when that occurred, but I don't think we embraced it. However, it became obvious as it was going to go forward that Canadian national interests would not be satisfied if we stood aside, because there was always the possibility that Mexico could negotiate a better deal than Canada had, and that we had to be a part of it. And then there were those who said and thought, and correctly, that there might be geopolitical advantages in having a tripartite agreement rather than a bilateral agreement. So I think that ultimately it became mainstream and politically acceptable and politically necessary to seek to widen the agreement to include Mexico. But Canada's starting point was not tripartite. As I said, the original advocate of tripartitism was Ronald Reagan, He did that in the 1980 campaign when he was leading up, before, I think when he was governor, when he was leading up to. And he had this notion of exceptionalism, and for him, I think possibly Mexico was a part. And he saw a free trade agreement not exclusively as Canada-US, but I think he saw Mexico as part of this embrace. Trudeau was intrigued by this, and in fact, I was, say, as the undersecretary, and I'd like to say as principal advisor at the time, saw real advantages in proposing a trilateral summit, not a free trade agreement. And Trudeau went on record early as favoring a trilateral summit, which we'd never had before, and trying to get the three leaders together to discuss things like environment and migration and issues of that sort. The idea was in the air, but Canada was mildly interested in promoting cooperation, but was not our initiative to go for a free trade area. I'd like to make one point, and it's a very personal one, and that is that I'm not sure where we're going on this at this time. We have the WACO Accords, the attempt, I don't know how much progress they're making, to lessen the border, the impact of the border. Some people have even referred to the quote-unquote Mexicanization of the Canadian border. I'm not sure. I've been an advocate, I am an advocate of going beyond NAFTA, a NAFTA plus, and having a deeper relationship between Canada and the United States. And I believe that it should be on the nature, it should be a single economic space with a common security perimeter. And I think it should be a goal of Canada. It is not a goal of the government this time. We have a minority government. It certainly would not be a preoccupation of the United States. They're interesting to be running in the opposite direction. But ultimately, if there's vision here, I think it's towards a European model in terms of the economic space and the kind of Vengan Accord where you can travel freely once you're in the space and you have a common criteria of how you get into the space. If where Mexico comes in, it seems to me, if it comes in at all, it comes in, as I see it, as it did in the free trade agreement, that ultimately, if we have a majority government in Canada with a strong leader that has this vision and he has a counterpart in the United States, I think Canada and the United States could negotiate such an arrangement. I think it's doable. I think it's possible. I don't think it would derogate from our sovereignty. I think it would do the opposite. And that ultimately that might be a template for Mexico to join in either all at once or by degrees. But I doubt that that common economic and security space could be easily negotiated between the three countries. I think because the problems on the southern border are completely different than the problems of the northern border. And as you may have been implying, we're seeing the wholesale importation of those problems on the lower border to the upper border. But I do think, and I cannot convince myself that I'm wrong, that the achievement of a single economic space, a single market, true single market between Canada and the United States, and a common security border, I can't convince myself that that's unobtainable. I think it's doable.
Paul Fekete, you spoke earlier about the fact that you don't view Canada as having any constituencies here in the United States. I'm just wondering whether you'd care to comment on a constituency of sort, which was the private sector, the business community, and the role they played, particularly during the free trade negotiations. Probably a mixed blessing in terms of domestic politics, but there were some corporations that did, in fact, try to take a broader view of the relationship, and I was just wondering if you could comment on your relationships of that kind.
Well, I think that constituency, yes, you're right, but I think it was a Canadian constituency. There is no question that the Canadian business had a major role. They got behind it completely. They conducted successfully one of the biggest campaigns they've ever done politically. Arguably, it was significant in its impact, but it was not. It was a Canadian constituency. There was an American business constituency, and I dealt with it. It was led by James Robinson, who was the CEO of American Express, but they were American companies. They weren't Canadian companies. And I don't think we ever thought that it would be helpful for Canadian companies to be trying to persuade Congress down here. That was a job for the American business. of course, those American companies had interests in Canada. So I think it was an example of a business on both sides of the border having an effect, but I don't think it was a Canadian constituency down here. On that issue of Canadian constituency, I could just add that the embassy here has been very active in building up its what it called an advocacy secretariat, and some very gifted people, minister responsible for it, have done an excellent job in building it up. And they have, some of the embassy staff have talked about and have published remarks saying that they're aiming to build a Canadian constituency. And there are prominent Canadians in different parts of the countries. Hollywood is the case in point. My reaction to that, frankly, when I heard about it, and if anybody asked me, which was did from time to time, I says, mark me down as a skeptic.
Maybe, though, we can let you move out into the room and into the other room and start working on this Canadian constituency, because I think you've got one here. And as an author, I think any author with a book should have a chance to get out and talk about it face to face and sign a few, perhaps also. So thank you for doing this today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. I believe there'll be refreshments served, the ambassador will be available, and books will be available too. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much. It's a wonderful interview. Thanks so much. Yeah.